Mad Max is one part brutalism and another part pure chaos, a franchise that is known for its eccentric, beat-down world oozing despair, pain, and bloodshed. A world where monstrous motorized machines display opulence and power. It's truly dissimilar to any other post-apocalyptic universe out there, and it's why today we are taking a deep dive look into the game. I'll be analyzing everything from its reception, the current controversy it's wrapped up in, if it's canon, and what the game is like, flaws and all. Mad Max launched in the last quarter of 2015 and was developed by Avalanche Studios, who are arguably best known for their Just Cause series, though I personally only really know them from this game and Rage 2. The studio worked in collaboration with Warner Bros. And at one point, the sole creator of this universe, George Miller, who later parted ways with the project. With recent information surfacing about the development of the game, it appears the final product the players got is not something George Miller had wanted. The original focus of the game, when given to Avalanche, was that it would be developed with a more traditional linear experience in mind, which we now know caused strife among the studio because, like the CEO of Avalanche, Christopher Sundberg, stated, they did everything they could to make this a complete linear game after having signed up with a developer of open world games. This inside scoop only really came to light recently because George Miller himself took shots at the quality of the game and inadvertently every individual who worked on it during his press tour for Furiosa, stating, "It wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. I'm one of those people that I'd rather not do something unless you can do it at the highest level." While it is very commendable to have a desire to put your all into everything, which is evident by how high quality his movies are, this man doesn't really know anything about game development. It's an entirely different medium, which is why the studio felt constricted by the linear mold that they were put into. This prompted the studio to throw out everything they had worked on over the course of the first year to reboot it as an open world experience. Quote, "After the first year of development, they realized they had forced us to make a linear experience rather than the open world game we pitched. The game started development sometime in 2012 with a release date in September of 2015. So while 3 years is more than enough time to cobble a game together, the studio really only had 2 years to get the game functional and enjoyable. And when playing the game, it's quite evident the team didn't have enough time to perfect it, something that I'm going to touch on later on. Nevertheless, Mad Max released to the public with a tumultuous launch. The reviews for the game varied drastically, with some fans and outlets praising the game for its admirable job of capturing the atmosphere and the world, while others revved their engines in disgust over how monotonous the game's mission structure, story, and open world is. While I agree with both sides of these reviews to a certain extent, the poor score surrounding the myriad of bugs the game launched with is entirely fair. Upon my first playthrough all those years ago, I had bug camps, missions I couldn't complete, a plethora of sound issues which actually still remain in the game today, among many others. Now, many players experienced bugs that prevented them from progressing through the game or obtaining 100% completion, which is a common gaming trend and triumph these days. It can now be elaborated on that Avalanche just didn't have time to fix all of these issues before the game launched, even with the studio attempting to get Warner Bros. To push back the release date, a request that was for more than one reason too. The additional reasoning behind this request was because the release date was scheduled for the exact same day as Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid: The Phantom Pain. Probably the most anticipated game of that year. It was announced to be Hideo Kojima's last entry in the franchise too, before parting ways with Konami, and when you have a beloved visionary game director like that releasing a game, you better step out of the way. I don't think many people hold Warner Bros. To the highest standards among the gaming industry, and nor does Avalanche, stating, "It was a hell of a great game, but released in a terrible release window, which we could not convince the publisher to do otherwise." While Warner Bros. Supposedly went on to blame Avalanche for the bad sales the game saw. Though we will never know the full story behind the development, I think it's fair to say that the CEO standing up and defending his company and staff over the creative differences of the game is quite laudable. Despite the bumpy road the game had to traverse after launch, it eventually stumbled upon smooth asphalt, seeing an overly positive rating on Steam and a 7.9 average score on Metacritic. Not that anyone actually really takes Metacritic seriously, but it's still there. In fact, if you go through YouTube, you'll scroll through countless videos talking about how the game is underrated and that it's actually good now. But that isn't what this video is. While I do love the game, there are many areas to critique and areas to praise in this analysis. We'll start with presentation. Mad Max's presentation is a medley of good and bad design choices and engine limitations. There are moments where the game displays astonishing views melded together with its highly contrasted colors akin to Fury Road. Others are brought down by its over-reliance on generic interiors that are essentially the same assets used in repetition to fill the spaces. Seldom do interiors provide the player player with any truly unique designs or visual storytelling to aid in the desire to see every location. The wasteland itself is thematically brought to life with love. Its desolate, harsh terrain stretches almost boundlessly, scattered with wreckages of a forgotten world, which man has survived by relying on total savagery and depravity. The weak are strung up around structures, skulls sit in place atop hoods of manned vehicles, storms blow through lands with gravitas, showing that people aren't the only thing to fear. What they did with the overworld exudes everything Mad Max represents at its core, and most importantly, it looks like the team had fun making it, challenges aside. Deserts are perhaps one of the hardest biomes and locations to make interesting, just merely due to how often they lack a wide diversity of colors and landmarks. A game that immediately comes to mind is Fallout New Vegas, a notorious game and one that is set in the Mojave Wasteland, but one that ultimately feels lacking in variety. There's not much deviation in the colors, which is also hurt by how washed out everything is. Mad Max uses a plethora of colors throughout its 4 different regions, including oranges, purples, greens, blues, and of course, lots of brown. Contrasting the colors in the game gets you images that have striking complementary colors. Simply driving around the world and taking in the sights is addicting, especially with the heft the driving carries, but I mean, that's something we're going to discuss later. The skyboxes and lighting are the 2 main reasons this game looks as good as it does. I'm not sure how they did it, but the skyboxes the game puts forth are staggeringly photorealistic, making one of the best stratospheres to gaze upon in any game out there. How a developer likes games is pretty important and can make or break the look of any game. Lighting has always been a way for designers to show the player items in the world or where to go in the most natural way possible, but it's also there to set a tone. Mad Max is run on Avalanche's proprietary Apex engine, a tool designed for open world games that is user-friendly enough to allow small teams to build good-looking, expansive worlds. And one way to ensure a game looks good is with the use of dynamic lighting. Light glistens through the wasteland, creating god rays that makes you stop and take in the view before you. I mentioned before that many of the game's interiors are less than desirable, but one positive aspect is how lighting can bring these cramped locations to life. Fire illuminates its surroundings and is contrasted nicely by the darker tones of any frame. If it wasn't for these advantageous techniques, these interiors would be completely devoid of anything positive. There is an overabundance of optional content, quote unquote, scattered around the world. Now, I say optional in quotes because people do like to defend the game's more egregious aspects by saying players don't have to engage with them, but more on that later. These locations will offer a myriad of objectives for the player that does give them an incentive to go into them for progression and customization reasons, but a big problem is once you've seen a couple, you've essentially seen them all. Each of these locations will have a different layout and sometimes enemy variety, but there is no true variety in colors or interesting things to see despite how many of them there are. It's entirely opposite of the overworld that, while barren for great stretches, consistently looks interesting and foreboding. These camps, outposts, and treasure hunts lead you to different layouts that all look too familiar. The franchise has always had interesting filming locations and set designs, yet the game didn't seem to lean on any of these as inspiration when they had George Miller's designs in their hands. This is no doubt due to the lack of time the team had, but one that, no matter the reason, brings down the presentation. Prime assets like Max, Chum Bucket, and the multitude of drivable vehicles have good detail, but aside from the cars, they never really look incredible. 2015 saw the release of many games, both critically acclaimed games like The Witcher 3 and The Phantom Pain to long-running franchise releases Assassin's Creed Syndicate and Fallout 4. All of the aforementioned have a leg up in the areas where Mad Max stumbles. But this game is full of minute details that do add to the overall package, simultaneously grounding the player in the world. When you leave your car running in the midday heat haze will be seen refracting off the exposed engine. Excess fuel not combusted leaks out of mufflers when the car is idle, igniting once you take off. Kicking up sand from convoys creates clouds that allows the player to locate them, but also makes them feel menacing. The presentation may not rise to the occasion of other games that came out around that time, but it still looks great. However, looks aren't everything, and what the player has available to do in the open world counts a lot more towards the viability of the game. The various open world activities were purposely tooled around a grind, giving the player a reason to partake in it, but not really offering the best content in doing so. All of the side content fuels itself into one goal, which is making Max more powerful by building Max up, his car the magnum opus, and liberating areas for upgrades to become more powerful so that late game areas are more easily able to be accomplished. Doing these activities rewards the player with scrap, the only currency in the game, customization options, buildable projects to aid in gameplay, and, well, That's pretty much it. The first area acts as an introduction to the game, getting the player used to the controls, showing them how the cars work and what the game is really going to be about story-wise, which we'll talk about in the story section. In doing this, the first half of the open world is free to explore. Taking down camps, beating up war boys, destroying convoys, and plowing through scarecrows comes across as fun, simply because the player is not yet aware of how many of these activities they will have to partake in if they want to fully upgrade the car in a timely manner. Upon overcoming a hurdle and progressing onward to the second section of the map, it becomes quite apparent that the game is not going to respect the player's time with the activities it has laid out. The later areas of the map unabashedly offer up the same content you just spent hours doing with no new additions. It doesn't take the player long to figure this out either, so it ruins a big part of exploration. Ultimately, knowing what the player will stumble upon, given that the game heavily pushes Ubisoft-style radio towers with less convenience just to see what points of interest there are. But unlike Ubisoft, Avalanche's renditions of these mechanics are more of a pain. Sometimes you'll have to find gas for a generator and fill the generator up, and other times you'll have to cripple support cables just to be able to use a hot air balloon. It's easy to see where Avalanche's Just Cause series rubs off onto this game. You'll either be making something explode or fighting guys, and occasionally taking on a top dog outpost that has a boss who is the exact same guy with different paint with the same moveset each time you fight him. There are many open world games that stuff fluff into a game so that players will hopefully engage with the game longer, hence retention rate. Ubisoft is the utmost prime example of this method. Yet in Ubisoft's favor, they often give the player less linear ways of tackling each arena. Stealth, action, a combination of both, or using outside resources for help like an animal. Whereas Mad Max is definitely open world, but has the strict linear gameplay and how the player engages with it throughout the open world and story. There are alternate ways to get into outposts, meaning you can sneak in if your car can't take on the outside defenses, but there is no stealth to be found here. The player will always be brutally punching opponents. There are systems that could have been streamlined to make the experience more enjoyable. Scrap plays a huge role in the game, a big reason why I said this content is optional in quotations earlier. Yes, the side content is totally optional. The game doesn't force you to do it, but it is necessary to do it if you want to upgrade the car, various outposts, and max, which do play a significant role in the success of late game locations. Additional car bodies, paints, and other customization options are also locked behind certain camps, so if you want to unlock any of that content, you need to partake in a handful of these. That being said, there should have definitely been an auto scrap pickup built into this game, because at least a solid hour and a half of my 20-hour playthrough was spent opening chests and holding down a button to pick up scrap. When you resolve a camp, the game still makes the player go around the camp to find all the pieces of scrap instead of collecting them once the encampment is cleared. There are just some weird design choices too, like seeing an end screen when you defeat a camp, but then also another end screen as soon as you collect everything. But the standouts are the objectives that mix traversal with combat. While the scarecrows are beyond repetitive, they are often close by and can easily be toppled while driving through the wasteland. Convoys require the player to dismantle an oil tanker and its surrounding escort. It can get chaotic, and it's where the game is at its peak Mad Max. These instances allowed me to put my car's current build to the test, ramming, harpooning, and shooting weak spots to attain victory and gain awesome looking hood ornaments. Races allow you to play dirty because the world is lawless. But how the open world gels with each individual is really going to be based around the next topic. The core gameplay of Mad Max is a hybrid between vehicular mayhem and on-foot hand-to-hand combat. When you aren't racing or blowing up rivaling factions, you'll be duking it out with whoever is unlucky enough to get in your way. It takes the beat-em-up formula established in early Assassin's Creed games and puts it in here in brutal fashion with its sound design and tactile visceral animations. A staple of many games published under Warner Bros., including the Batman Arkham series and Mordor games. While many comparisons can be drawn between the three, tonally Mad Max's system has much more grit to it than any previous games. Shadow of Mordor has spectacle violence, flashy moves, and a fantasy flair. After all, it is a fantasy game. Max's fist connecting with a warboy's arm and hearing it snap like a twig from the kinetic energy is glorious, but also uncomfortable at times. Purchasing skills furthers the movesets you can exert, and upgrades adorned on Max's model increase the ferociousness of his attacks. Picking up a foe and doing a WWE style suplex move while hearing their heads meet the floor is dangerously addictive. Added moves include clotheslining, cracking a stunned enemy's head into a nearby surface, and drop-kicking an adversary straight off their feet. The flow of this combat is aided by the parry system, with it built in to reward perfect parries with increased attack damage, not dissimilar to other games of this nature. The shotgun and shiv can be used in combination with the core system for quick advantages on gaining the upper hand, though once the player has the combat and parry system down, there is a severe lack of death-rearing challenge to it. A sentiment that is honestly shared throughout all aspects of the game. The simple fact is, many initiated gamers won't have a tremendous amount of challenge or much challenge at all, which at times can feel at odds with how dangerous the world is supposed to be. While I've been praising the boots on the ground style gameplay, it's certainly not impervious to its problems. Lack of difficulty aside, the system inherently lacks combos, strategies, and in-depth fighting mechanics found in other games. It's a simplistic formula with a light attack, heavy attack, roll, and parry. There is really nothing for the player to master, as there is no real depth, even with the added tools. There are no combinations of buttons to push to pull off a cool move. A lot of the more brutish fighting animations happen by simply holding the heavy attack button mid-fight. There are the occasional adversaries that pose a threat to the smooth flow of combat. Shielded guys stunt the combo meter if you hit them, but unlocking a shield bash ability renders them pretty harmless later on. It's certainly hurt by how linear it is, because there aren't many ways to solve a combat encounter other than brute force. There are no mines to lay down, Molotovs to chuck, or handheld melee weapons to upgrade to shake up fights. There are melee weapons found around camps, but they lack punch for instruments of death and aren't entirely worth picking up in the first place. Max's Rage mode is meant to enhance combat, where the player becomes unstoppable for a short amount of time and deals significantly more damage. An interesting concept because it's meant to tie directly into the character itself, with the team remarking on how unstable Max's mental state is and how angry he is at the world. A broken personality that's meant to come out in this mechanic. It does its job adding a power trip mid-fight. A missed opportunity though to give the player a choice on when to use it because it kicks in automatically once a gauge is filled. An odd decision made by a developer that is known for giving player agency. Yet despite the hindrances, the combat becomes addictive, at least it did for me. The simplistic nature of it never left me feeling accomplished in a challenge sort of way, but I always felt like a total unit destroying everything in my path. The game often excels in giving the player freedom to be as destructive as possible, and what better way to do that than with the car combat. The 8-cylinder engine erupts in a cranking display of power, kicking up dust in the trail it leaves behind. This is where Mad Max as a game comes together. While Max's upgrade trees may be somewhat limiting to the gameplay on foot, what doesn't share the same fate is the freedom car combat affords the player. Many of these sequences will indeed follow a certain path, like when doing a convoy, but the upgrades you get for the car allow you to tackle these encounters using different tools and strategies. Aside from pimping out the car with your offensive and defensive armors, the car gets a sniper rifle, a grappling cable, a rocket launcher, side-mounted flamethrowers, and finally, Max's shotgun. All of which have their purposes. Convoys and car combat alike have other outcomes than just full-on destruction with the tools that you can upgrade. Thinning the herd of cars is made easier when you can pull a tire right off the axle, putting it out of commission. The shotgun can detonate explosive canisters on exposed cars, the boomstick launcher deals massive damage to armored vehicles, while the sniper rifle is just more of a scouting tool for bases. Unlike many other games that utilize driving, the magnum opus and subsequent vehicles carry heft that's felt in the acceleration, speed, and handling. Each car feels different. Because the game is driven by upgrading the car, the upgrades needed to feel sufficient enough to justify collecting scrap to do so. Thankfully it does. Each upgrade improves the car, including acceleration, handling, suspension to absorb the force of landing after a jump, and more. No matter the body type the player chooses when starting out, the car will feel admittedly underwhelming by design. Not only do the upgrades impact the feeling of the car and how much damage it can take, but it allows the player freedom to personalize their ride. The only downside to the vehicles is that you just can't customize big rigs. Still, if there is any reason to play Mad Max, it's the excellent combat. But the gameplay doesn't just consist of making mincemeat and scrap metal from everything you see. There are hints at the game taking shape as a survival hybrid with the gas and water system. Resources the player can keep stock of to keep their car fueled and health bar full. Yet they feel like last minute additions that don't add to the gameplay or urgency in any way. Once you get far enough into the game, strongholds will replenish gas in the car and water is found in abundance. I filled my car up once in my 20 hours and only used the health system a handful of times. There are vehicles to find in the open world to add to your drivable collection, historic relics that Max gives insight on, and new car bodies, treasure hunts, and prefabricated builds of cars to put together known as archangels. I just wouldn't necessarily say that any of them are worth chasing. They offer nothing new, and the plethora of vehicles you can collect out in the world take away Chum Bucket, and with it, most of the defenses you've gained access to. Some cars can be used to go through faction-controlled areas undetected, but there is never really a set of circumstances where it's necessary to do so, nor is it much of a strategy. When you're on foot, bases have obstacles to your progress, like doors that require explosives to get through. These areas will always have a jerry can laying around that will respawn because the devs knew it was the only way to get through these spiked blockages, and if the player messed up a throw, they'd need another gas can. This occurs way more than it should and is just as repetitive as it sounds. I guess what I'm trying to say is that gameplay is relatively uninteresting outside of driving, the combat, and the photo mode that has no right being as good as it is. But the true victim that sits atop the column of uninteresting aspects of the game is the narrative, one that is here in spite of how sparse it is. It's not aiming to tell a tragic story about the human condition or the hardships of the life in the wasteland, even when the story tries to introduce these elements way too late. The pacing lacks any kind of steady rhythm with a slow start and a swift third act. The bulk of Max's journey is driven by the need to rebuild a car with a V8 engine after his is taken by the main antagonist Scrotus so that he can drive into the plains of silence to seek peace. It's full of uninteresting characters, bad writing, and set pieces. Most of it can be summed up as fetch quests and open world activities. The villains are one-dimensional and so too are their boss battles. They rarely make appearances because they are unaware of who Max is or even that he's still alive from Scrotus's earlier encounter. It's a story built to push the gameplay instead of one that works in tandem with it. Max reluctantly sides with the best character in the game, Chumbucket, a hunchback mechanic who worships a pseudo-religion based around cars with an unsettling, intimate bond. Max is a man of few words, so Chumbucket often fills in the gaps of silence with his outwardly cartoonish personality.
You have your secret reasons. I'll follow you, because I think fate favors old chum.
Both his lines and voice acting do a good job of depicting how crooked the world has become to form a being of his caliber. His arc is the only one that really has a definitive beginning, middle, and end, seeing Max as a godlike figure to his religion, helping him build up a car only to steal the vehicle and eventually die with his beliefs. Well, that's just a really quick summary of events. It's really about Chumbucket trying to find a place he belongs in the world that's bent on killing him. His death is actually successful in eliciting some emotion. Max doesn't change at all from where he starts and ends. He's a brutish ass that seeks help from various people to get what he wants, only occasionally showing emotions other than anger. These more vulnerable emotions surface when the game attempts to put a possible love interest into the third act through Hope, a woman who has lost her daughter, Glory, to savages that the player has to save. I can appreciate what the characters are trying to do for the story and what their obvious names represent. Hope instills hope in Max, enough to believe in a cause and save Glory, the little girl that reminds him of his glorious family, but is immediately stripped away a mission later. It ultimately feels like time wasted when Max ends up again with nothing. However, from a gameplay perspective, it doesn't hinder it because it's intentionally about leveling up Max in his car. This is the main purpose of the story until the third act, and even then, the game ends the way it starts, with Max traversing the miles of sand ahead on his own. However, interestingly enough, this ending is probably for good reason. Although it has been said otherwise, it's believed by many that this game was meant to sit around the timeline of Fury Road. But this is very much a non-canon game. To this day, there are still people who ask if this is canon, and the answer is no. The game's villain Scrotus is said to be the son of Immortan Joe, but his design is almost exactly the same as Immortan Joe's son in Fury Road, Rictus. You can certainly tell that they use George Miller's concepts and names, but the movies follow a different Max entirely. In reality, there isn't much of a timeline to begin with George Miller stating that each film was more like a campfire story than anything definitive. But what is definitive is how fun the game is. It sputters across the desert floor with a lot of its design choices that don't hold up over its 15 to 20-ish hours due to poor repetition, but the simplistic systems that make up the car customization and combat really nail what fans of this franchise love. The high-octane vehicular mayhem and gritty close-quarters fights translates well to the gaming medium and does the series justice in its pursuit of over-the-top violence and insanity while looking rustically stylish. It is the driving force behind what enjoyment there is to be found here. It's quite a shame the game didn't take more liberties with interior designs and locations, but the game is quite stunning when cruising the great expanses. But all these years later, it's still fun and a reminder of how effective primitive combat in vehicles can be, an element sorely missing from this generation. And with that, my analysis of the Mad Max game is coming to an end. Let me know if you agree with me, disagree with me. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hey, maybe even share with a friend if you thought it was entertaining or informative in any way. I appreciate you all for watching, and that's it for me. Good night, and good lunch.